Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I didn't expect brunch to turn into a damn hostage negotiation, but there I was, sitting across from my brother's fiancée at that overpriced downtown cafe, sipping a watered-down mimosa while she delivered what I can only describe as the most arrogant, manipulative proposal I'd ever heard in my life. Brittany had that sugary sweet voice women use when they're about to serve you poison on a silver platter. She tucked her bleach blonde hair behind one ear, leaned in like we were best friends, and said, "So, Emily, I wanted to talk to you about something really important for the wedding." I nodded, thinking maybe she wanted help with centerpieces or seating charts. You know, normal wedding stuff. But then she dropped it like a bomb made of rhinestones and entitlement. "You know, it's customary for close family to give generous wedding gifts," she said, smiling like a Botox Stepford wife. "We were thinking 10,000 would be appropriate. Otherwise, you might ruin the vibe." I actually laughed at first. Not a polite chuckle, a full, reflexive laugh, like my brain couldn't quite process the words fast enough and assumed she was joking. But Brittany didn't laugh back. Her smile froze in place, her eyes sharp as glass. I realized, then and there, she was dead serious. $10,000. Not as a loan. Not as a contribution. But as some kind of ticket to be seen as worthy in her perfect Instagram wedding fantasy. My stomach flipped. I set my glass down carefully, as if moving too fast might make this whole absurd conversation worse. "I'm sorry," I said slowly, still trying to keep it civil. "Are you actually asking me for $10,000? She nodded, casually swirling her own drink like this was the most normal thing in the world. "Not asking, just suggesting. I mean, you're his only sibling. We really want this day to feel special. And, well, we know how you can be." I blinked. "How I can be?" She tilted her head and gave that patronizing little laugh that made my teeth itch. "You know, a little intense, critical, and honestly, your energy tends to shift the room. This would help balance that out. Show you're really supporting us." That's when it clicked. This wasn't about a gift. It was hush money, disguised in a pastel bow. It was her way of saying, pay up or stay away. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "No. I'm not giving you $10,000. I don't owe you that, and frankly, I don't owe you anything." She didn't even blink. Just shrugged and said, "I figured you'd say that. Ryan said you'd probably make it about yourself." That one hit me harder than I expected. Because Ryan, my younger brother, my partner in crime since we were kids, was the last person I thought would ever think that way about me. I swallowed hard. "Ryan knows about this?" I asked. "Of course," she said casually. "He just wants everything to go smoothly, and your attitude has been an issue before." That word again. Attitude. Funny how people use that word when they're really trying to tell you to shrink yourself down into something more convenient. I didn't answer right away. I just paid my half of the bill and walked out. I thought that was the end of it, that maybe Brittany would stew in her own entitlement and let it go. But no, that was just the beginning. The next day, my mother called. "No, hello. No, how are you?" "Just, Emily, I heard you had a conversation with Brittany." My voice stayed even. "Yeah, I did. She asked me for $10,000. There was a pause, then the unmistakable sigh of disappointment. The kind only a mother can give, one that says without words, "You're already the problem." "Emily," she said, "this is a very important time for your brother. Can't you just support them?" "Support them how? By giving them money I don't have, just to be allowed to attend?" "Don't twist this," she snapped. "You're being selfish. You always make things about you." I could feel the heat crawling up my neck. "So, I'm selfish for not handing over 10 grand to someone who clearly can't stand me?" "She's trying to include you," my mom said, voice tight. "And you're throwing it in her face." That's when I realized my family didn't just believe Brittany's version of things, they'd already chosen her side. Maybe they chose at the moment Ryan brought her home. Maybe I never really had a place in that house to begin with. But what came next? That still shocked me. That same evening, my dad called me. His tone wasn't angry, it was cold. Detached. Like he was reading a script. "Emily," he said, Your mother and I talked, and if you're not going to contribute to the wedding in a meaningful way, maybe it's best you don't come at all." My breath caught in my throat. "You're uninviting me? We just don't want any tension. Brittany's already under a lot of stress." I stared at the wall, trying to process what I was hearing. My own family, my own flesh and blood, was cutting me out of my brother's wedding, not because I did something cruel, not because I caused some drama, but because I wouldn't buy my way in with a check. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just said, "Fine," and hung up the phone. But in that silence, something inside me shifted. Something heavy and sharp. They wanted me gone? Fine. They'd get exactly what they asked for. But not before I showed them what it really felt like to be discarded. I thought that phone call from my father would be the worst part, the moment I'd remember as the bottom of it all. But I was wrong, because the real sting didn't come from the words themselves, it came from what followed. The silence. The vacuum. The way everything that used to be familiar, warm, chaotic, sometimes even annoying, suddenly shut its doors in my face, like I'd become some kind of contagious disease no one wanted to acknowledge. One day, I was the sister, the daughter, the part of the family group text that shared dumb memes and casserole recipes and updates about Aunt Linda's never-ending gallbladder problems. The next day, I was erased, scrubbed out of everything like I'd never existed in the first place. I checked the family group chat out of habit that night. It was still buzzing. Photos of the wedding venue. Brittany smiling in a dress shop. My mom gushing about floral arrangements like she hadn't just banished her only daughter from the most important day of her son's life. No one said a word about me. Not a single mention. Not even from Ryan. And his silence, that was the part that didn't just bruise, it broke something. Because I could have handled Brittany's performative bullshit. I could have handled my parents playing favorites, hell, they'd been doing that since we were teenagers. But Ryan? He wasn't supposed to fold. He wasn't supposed to disappear. I texted him once. Just once. A simple message, "Are you seriously okay with this?" He didn't reply. Not even a damn thumbs up or a shrug emoji. Just silence, like my question had never arrived. A week later, I saw him posting happy couple pictures online, captioned with those cringeworthy love quotes, "Forever starts now," or some garbage like that. I stared at my screen, reading through the comments. My mom had written, "So proud of you both." My dad, "Our hearts are full." Mine? Empty. It wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It was the dinners I wasn't invited to. The bridal shower I didn't even know was happening until I saw the photos online. It was every tiny exclusion, every moment I was ghosted by the people who used to call me family. My mom called once, maybe to pretend like things were still normal, but it lasted all of 3 minutes before she hit me with, "Brittany's really stressed right now. It's just easier this way." Easier for who? Easier for them to pretend I didn't exist? Easier to pretend their perfect little wedding wouldn't be tainted by the presence of their inconvenient, opinionated daughter who wouldn't write a fat check just to be tolerated? I didn't bother fighting. What was the point? I wasn't going to beg to be part of something I was being clearly and repeatedly excluded from. But that didn't mean I didn't feel it. Every time I opened my phone, every time I remembered the years I'd spent helping Ryan with homework, covering for him when he'd sneak out, standing by him through every damn breakup and meltdown. And now here he was, standing by while his fiancée threw me under the bus, and our parents gladly helped her drive it. And somewhere around that second week of silence, I started asking myself the kind of questions that keep you awake at night, questions that stick in your throat like glass. Was I ever really part of this family, or was I just a placeholder until something shinier came along? Did they love me because of who I was, or did they tolerate me because they had to? Because it's amazing how fast people show you their real faces when you stop serving their needs. Have you ever been treated like an outsider in your own family? When did it hit you? That gut punch realization that blood doesn't mean loyalty, and sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are just waiting for a convenient reason to cut you off. Drop your stories below. I know I'm not the only one who's felt this kind of betrayal crawl under their skin. A few days later, just when I'd settled into the bitter rhythm of being forgotten, a strange little envelope showed up in my mailbox. No return address, just soft gold trim and the cheap scent of drugstore perfume clinging to the paper. Inside was an invitation, ornate, embossed, tacky as hell. You are cordially invited to celebrate the wedding of Ryan and Brittany. My hands tightened around the paper before I noticed a handwritten note tucked inside, in loopy cursive that definitely didn't belong to my mother. It read, "Hope you can make it after all. Brittany said you were welcome again. But don't forget the gift." I stared at it, my mouth hanging open, disbelief curdling into something darker. That damn gift again. Like that was the price of admission. The only thing that would make me acceptable in their curated fairy tale. They didn't want me there. They wanted the image of me. The proof that their family was complete. The photo op. A box to check. I folded the invitation back into the envelope, slowly, carefully, like it was something toxic. And I stood there for a long time, just staring out the window, wondering how people could twist family into something so transactional, so hollow, and still sleep at night. I didn't know yet what I'd do. But I knew one thing for sure. If I was going to that wedding, I wasn't going to play their game. Not on their terms. Not quietly. Not anymore. There's a moment, somewhere between the third sleepless night and the fourth glass of cheap red wine, when the pain stops feeling like heartbreak and starts feeling like heat. A kind of quiet, creeping rage that simmers under your ribs and whispers that maybe you weren't overreacting after all. That maybe the problem isn't you. That maybe it never was. I spent days after that invitation arrived just pacing my apartment, reading and rereading that note from Brittany's stepmom, wondering what kind of sick game they thought they were playing. Inviting me back only after publicly cutting me out, as if I'd come crawling back with a wrapped box and a smile, just to be allowed in their perfect photo album. I kept thinking, maybe I should just burn the damn thing, tear it up, block every number tied to that family and pretend I never got it. But that kind of clean break requires peace, and I didn't have an ounce of peace left in me. What I had was confusion, insult, grief, and something else, something sharp and growing. It wasn't just the exclusion that hurt. It was the gaslighting, the expectation that I should feel lucky to be re-included, as if being discarded in the first place wasn't the real betrayal. Lindsay showed up one night with a pizza, a six-pack, and that look she gets when she knows I've gone too deep inside my own head. She didn't even ask what was wrong. She just cracked open a beer, shoved a slice into my hand, and said, "Okay, time to talk." I started rambling, half anger, half despair, telling her everything from Brittany's smug little smirk to the way my mom's voice had turned into a stranger's. I poured it all out, unfiltered, unedited, until I couldn't tell whether I wanted to scream or cry or sleep for 3 days straight. When I finally stopped, Lindsay leaned back, took a long drink, and said, "You want to go to that wedding? Then go. But go for yourself. Not for them. Not to prove anything. Go to remind them you still exist, and you don't need their goddamn approval." And just like that, something clicked. Not a full plan, not yet, but a seed. I wasn't going to let them think they'd erased me. I wasn't going to play nice, smile sweetly, and fade into the background just to make Brittany's day sparkle. If they were going to insist I show up, then fine, I'd show up. But I'd do it on my terms. I remembered something then, something small and stupid but suddenly potent. Back in college, Brittany used to flirt relentlessly with this guy I was seeing. Not outright cheating, but those subtle little jabs, touching his arm too long, laughing too loud at his jokes, showing up at places she knew we'd be. And now, years later, he was still around, still local, still single, and still more than willing to attend a wedding with a bit of chaotic charm in his pocket. I called him up, told him I needed a +1 for a wedding. He didn't even hesitate, said he'd wear a tie, smile politely, and make it look like we were the picture of content, just to see the look on Brittany's face. I didn't even need to explain the full story. He already knew the type. Hell, he'd seen it firsthand. The day of the wedding, I walked into that venue with my head high and my dress sharp, nothing flashy, nothing desperate, but striking enough to make sure no one forgot I was there. People noticed. Oh, they noticed. Brittany's face when she saw who was on my arm, it twitched just slightly, but enough for me to see it. Enough to know I'd already won something before the ceremony even started. The reception was a circus of fake hugs and backhanded compliments. My mother barely looked me in the eye, and my father just nodded like I was some distant cousin rather than the daughter he'd raised. Brittany floated around the room like a pageant queen, every movement choreographed, every smile brittle around the edges. I stayed quiet, stayed polite, but I watched everything. Every micro-expression. Every whispered exchange. I didn't need to cause a scene to make a point. I just needed to exist there, to take up space they had hoped I'd vacate. At one point, I caught Brittany and her bridesmaids clustered near the bar, heads leaned in close, whispering behind champagne flutes. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, not exactly, but I was close enough to hear the hiss of her voice when she thought no one important was listening. "She's so bitter," she said, laughing into her glass. Honestly, I just didn't want her face ruining the photos. And that was it. That was the moment. Not the insult itself. I could have expected something like that, but the smugness behind it, the absolute certainty that she'd won. That I'd shown up and played right into her hands. But she had no idea what was coming next. Because I hadn't just come to be seen. I'd come to remember exactly how far I was willing to go to remind these people that cutting me out had a price. I didn't say a word. I just smiled, turned away, and let the plan start forming fully in my mind. Because if they thought this was over, they were about to learn the hard way that some people don't fight with screaming matches or broken glasses. Some people fight with silence, patience, and one hell of a good exit. I left the wedding reception before the cake was even cut, slipping out the side door without saying a word to anyone, not even the few distant cousins who still remembered my name. I didn't need a dramatic exit or some big blow-up scene. I wasn't going to give them that kind of satisfaction. I didn't need to shout or throw a drink or storm across the dance floor like some drunk aunt at a Thanksgiving meltdown. No, that wasn't my style. Not anymore. I walked out with my head up and my jaw clenched so tight it hurt, my heels clicking against the marble floor as I made my way through the cold silence of the parking lot, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. But something had shifted, something subtle but irreversible, somewhere deep under my ribs, something brittle that finally cracked after all those years of trying to hold it together. It wasn't just about this wedding anymore, or Brittany's smug little jabs, or even my brother's cowardly silence. This was bigger than that. This was about every moment I'd ever been made to feel small, every time my voice had been ignored, every sideways glance from my mother, every passive-aggressive comment from my father about how I take things too personally, and every time Ryan got away with murder while I got blamed for breathing too loud. As I drove home, I couldn't stop the memories from rolling in uninvited, sharp-edged, flooding the car like a tide I couldn't hold back. I remembered being 12 and getting grounded for snapping at Ryan after he broke my science fair project. I remembered being 17 and getting lectured for dressing too provocatively, while Brittany, even then, was praised for her confidence and charm. I remembered Thanksgiving dinners where I did most of the cooking while my mother cooed over Brittany's store-bought pie. I remembered the time my dad said, after I got promoted at work, "Well, good for you, but maybe now you'll stop being so defensive all the time." I remembered it all. Every quiet betrayal wrapped in polite smiles and hollow praise. Every time I'd swallowed my pride just to keep the peace. Every time I'd told myself it wasn't worth it to fight back. But now, something inside me said, screw the peace. Screw the pretending. Screw the version of myself they'd tried to mold. The docile, grateful, agreeable daughter who nodded politely and knew when to disappear. That girl was gone. What was left was something sharper, colder, and frankly, a hell of a lot more honest. And maybe it was the champagne talking, or maybe it was the years of bottled-up humiliation finally boiling over, but as I drove past my parents' house on the way back, something pulled me in that direction like a magnet. I slowed down. I stared at the dark, empty driveway. I knew they were still at the reception, probably clinking glasses and posing for photos with the perfect daughter-in-law. I pulled over and sat there for a minute, engine humming, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the porch light flicker in the wind like it was waiting for me. And then I heard her voice in my head again, that smug little sentence she'd said months ago while talking about her wedding aesthetic, like everything was a damn Pinterest board. Everything has a vibe, she'd said, smiling that fake model smile. Trash belongs in trash. At the time, I'd brushed it off, filed it under her usual stream of vapid nonsense, but now it echoed differently. Now it sounded like a challenge. Like a dare. Like an invitation I never asked for but suddenly couldn't turn down. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, not rushed, not frantic, just calm in that eerie way people get when they know exactly what they're about to do. I popped the trunk and stared at the stack of heavy-duty black contractor bags I kept back there from a recent apartment purge, bags thick enough to hold anything, strong enough to carry whatever weight you wanted to throw inside. And in that moment, everything clicked into place with surgical clarity. I wasn't going to scream or fight or write a dramatic letter. I wasn't going to confront them or beg for understanding or try to change anyone's mind. That ship had sailed, burned, and sunk years ago. What I was going to do, what I needed to do, was give them a little taste of what it feels like to be discarded. To be treated like clutter. To be reminded that the things you take for granted can disappear without warning. I grabbed 3 bags, slammed the trunk shut, and headed toward the front steps of my parents' house with the same calm, slow walk I'd had leaving the wedding. This wasn't revenge. This was reflection. A mirror. A lesson. And the best part? They wouldn't even see it coming. The night air was cool and silent, not a soul in sight on the street. Nothing but the hum of distant traffic and the creak of the porch floorboards under my feet. I took one long look at the front door, the same door I used to walk through with birthday cakes, groceries, armfuls of holiday gifts. I exhaled slowly and reached for the handle on the first garbage bag. And that's where I'll leave it for now. Me, standing on my parents' porch, contractor bags in hand, while the happy couple twirls through their first dance across town, completely unaware of what's unfolding back home. Because sometimes, when you're pushed far enough, when the switch finally flips, you don't burn bridges. You just quietly roll up your sleeves and start taking out the trash. There's a strange kind of clarity that settles in once you've made peace with the fact that you're no longer anyone's priority, that your place in a family can be revoked with the same cold indifference as canceling a dinner reservation. I stood on that front porch under the dim flicker of the overhead light, looking around at the carefully arranged remnants of my parents' domestic pride, the polished flower pots with those tacky ceramic butterflies, the 2 matching lawn chairs with the faded cushions my mom refused to throw out, the little gnome my dad called Captain, like giving a name to a lump of painted concrete somehow made it sentimental. Every piece of it suddenly looked absurd, hollow, like set dressing on a stage where I was never meant to speak. I didn't rush. I didn't make a sound louder than a soft thud as I started loading things into the contractor bags, one by one, methodically, deliberately, like I was sorting through debris after a storm. The flower pots went first, those oversized symbols of forced hospitality, packed tightly into the first bag, dirt and roots spilling over my fingers. The chairs followed, awkward but manageable, legs scraping quietly against the porch floor before I wrapped them in plastic and shoved them into the second bag. Then came the gnome, Captain himself, the self-proclaimed guardian of a family that didn't think twice about casting out its own. He slid into the bottom of the third bag with a satisfying weight, like even he was tired of pretending everything was fine. Once the porch was bare, I moved inside. The key was still under the mat, just like it always had been, because no matter how spiteful my parents could be, they still clung to routines. I stepped into the house and paused for a second, breathing in that familiar scent, old wood, lemon cleaner, a hint of something floral my mother had sprayed for years. It hit me in the gut harder than I expected, that scent, like some ghost of a childhood that felt more distant by the minute. But I didn't let it stop me. I started in the kitchen. The fruit bowl, the souvenir mugs from beach trips I'd never been invited to, the decorative cutting boards with dumb quotes like, live, laugh, love, all of it went into the bags. Every fragile thing wrapped carefully, not out of kindness, but because I wanted them to wonder how I'd done it so cleanly. Then the framed photos from the hallway, wedding pictures, graduation portraits, all those posed moments that told a story they loved to believe in. I took every single one, leaving the walls bare, hollow echoes of curated happiness. My father's golf clubs were next, a prized set he polished more often than he ever polished his words to me. I carried them out in 2 trips, wrapped them tight, and stacked them beside the others. By the time I was done, the contractor bags were heavy with the weight of things they'd treasured, not because they were valuable, but because they represented a life they had convinced themselves was perfectly intact. I loaded them into my car slowly, double-checking each bag, making sure nothing was left behind, nothing they could cling to as proof that things were still as they'd been. The trunk was full, the back seat stacked nearly to the ceiling. I drove across town in silence, not even bothering with music, just letting the hum of the road fill the space where guilt might have tried to live. There was none. Not even a flicker of doubt. Just resolve. The thrift store lot was empty when I arrived, just the humming buzz of a flickering security light and the industrial dumpster looming like a mouth waiting to swallow everything. One by one, I hauled the bags out of my car and tossed them into the bin. Some landed with a dull thud, others cracked faintly, glass against metal, wood against plastic. It didn't matter. It was done. All of it gone, swallowed by the dark belly of a place no one looks twice at. But before I left, I returned to the house one last time. I walked up to the front door, pulled a pen and scrap of paper from my purse, and wrote out one simple sentence. I taped it to the door, right under the house number, where my mother's eyes would land first when she came home. Since I'm not family anymore, figured you'd want your house to reflect that. No signature. No explanation. Just that one quiet punch to the gut, delivered without shouting, without violence, without a single broken plate. Just absence. A house stripped of its sentimental armor, emptied by the very person they'd so effortlessly discarded. I got in my car, turned the key, and drove away without looking back. Not once. Not even when I turned the corner and their house disappeared from the rearview mirror like a fading ghost. I didn't need to see the fallout. I didn't need the confrontation or the tears or the performance of wounded innocence I knew would follow. I'd made my point. They'd wake up tomorrow thinking everything was still as they'd left it, only to discover that the world they'd built was a little emptier, a little colder, and maybe, just maybe, a little less sure of itself. 2 days later, my phone lit up with a voicemail. Just one. I didn't recognize the number right away, but I played it anyway, letting the speaker crackle through the quiet of my apartment. It was my mother's voice, strained and trembling and furious. "Where the hell is everything? Did you rob us? What the hell did you do? You better call me back right now." I didn't. I just stared at the wall and let the message play again and again and again until the anger in her voice started to sound a little like fear. And I smiled, not wide, not wicked, just the kind of smile that comes from knowing you finally said something they can't ignore, even without saying a word. I didn't answer the voicemail, not then, not the next day, not the day after that. I let it sit in my inbox like a ticking bomb that never quite went off, a small artifact of their outrage that no longer had any power over me. I didn't feel guilt, not even a flicker. Just a strange sense of stillness, like I had finally walked out of a room I'd been trapped in my whole damn life. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. It wasn't triumph or glee. It was quieter than that, heavier, but steadier somehow. For once, I wasn't reacting, I was choosing. And that made all the difference. A few days after the voicemail, Ryan called me. The name flashing across my screen was like seeing a ghost, a piece of a life I'd left behind, but still carried in my bones. I didn't answer the first time. He called again the next day, and that time I picked up, partly out of curiosity and partly because I wanted to hear what excuse he'd come up with after months of silence. His voice was soft, hesitant, almost like a child caught doing something wrong, but still too proud to admit it. "You didn't have to do that," he said, skipping any kind of greeting. "No, hi, no, how have you been?" Just straight into that familiar tone of quiet reprimand that had always made me feel like I was the unreasonable one. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence stretch, let him sit in it. When I finally spoke, my voice was flat. No, I didn't. But I wanted to. He exhaled sharply, not quite a sigh, more like frustration he didn't know how to package politely. You could have just talked to them. You didn't have to go nuclear. That word, nuclear, made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurdly out of proportion. I hadn't smashed windows or spray-painted the house or ruined their precious reception. I hadn't stolen anything. I hadn't even raised my voice. But sure, in his world, a few garbage bags and a note counted as an act of war. It wasn't nuclear, I said. It was accurate. He didn't have a response to that. Just a pause, heavy and uncomfortable, before mumbling something about hoping we could talk soon and then hanging up before I could answer. Meanwhile, Brittany had already started her little social media campaign. I didn't follow her, but Lindsay sent me screenshots. Posts full of filtered selfies and soft lighting with captions like, "Some people can't stand to see others happy," or "Jealousy is the ugliest color." One even said, "Some people would rather tear you down than deal with their own bitterness." Subtle like a sledgehammer, as always. I almost admired the consistency. She never missed a chance to play victim in her own soap opera. Even when the villain wasn't chasing her, it was just walking away. The real fireworks came when my parents showed up at my apartment. I heard the knock before I even saw their car pull in, but I knew it was them before I opened the door. There's a particular kind of pounding people do when they think they're entitled to your time. I opened the door and there they were, my mother with her lips pressed so tight they practically disappeared, my father with his jaw clenched so hard it looked like it might snap off. The fury on their faces was theatrical, performative, like they had rehearsed this confrontation in the car and were just waiting for their cue. My mother started in immediately, a barrage of questions spat out like bullets. How could you? What were you thinking? Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? I didn't flinch. I didn't apologize. I just stood there, leaning against the door frame, arms crossed, letting them wear themselves out. When my father finally stepped in, trying to sound calmer, trying to play the reasonable patriarch, I cut him off with a smile so dry it could cut glass. Funny how y'all suddenly remember my address. That stopped them cold for a second. Just one beat of silence before my mother snapped, "That's not fair," like fairness had ever been part of their vocabulary when it came to me. Neither was cutting me out of my own brother's wedding, I replied. Neither was treating me like an inconvenience you'd rather pretend didn't exist. They didn't have a real answer, just more bluster, more self-righteous noise, more accusations dressed up as concern. I didn't invite them in. I didn't raise my voice. I let them throw their tantrum on the doorstep of a life they were no longer welcome in. And when they finally stormed off, huffing about consequences and how I'd regret this, I shut the door behind them and locked it quietly, not out of fear, but out of peace. I didn't destroy anything. I just moved it. I didn't steal or scream or set fire to their happy little fantasy. I just returned the favor. I guess they thought all that stuff was priceless until it was sitting by a dumpster. Kinda like how I felt for most of my life. Sometimes revenge isn't loud. It's not screaming or slamming doors or ruining their wedding cake. Sometimes it's just letting them feel exactly what they made you feel. It's silence, absence, a house a little emptier than before, a memory a little harder to ignore, a feeling they can't quite name but won't be able to shake. But maybe I went too far. Maybe I crossed a line. Or maybe, finally, I stood up for myself in a way they couldn't brush off with another fake smile and another passive-aggressive dig over Sunday dinner. I don't know. I really don't. What would you have done? Would you have kept quiet, swallowed the hurt, smiled through the betrayal just to keep the family peace? Or would you have done exactly what I did, looked them straight in the eye and said, without a word, "You don't get to throw me away without losing something too"?